The story begins in the shimmer of the Nile, where gold-lit waves reflected temples and tombs older than memory, and the cry of ibis echoed like prophecy across the floodplain. In that divine geography, between gods and mortals, was born Arsinoe, daughter of Ptolemy I Soter, general of Alexander the Great, founder of a dynasty, and dreamer who sought to make himself pharaoh in a land that was not his. From the moment she opened her eyes to the light of Alexandria, she was more than a child. She was a symbol, a vessel through which her father could graft Greek ambition to Egyptian eternity. The palace in which she grew was an empire in miniature, marble colonnades meeting painted papyrus halls, Greek scholars murmuring beside priests of Ra, Macedonian guards standing before altars of Isis. Every corridor breathed of conquest and of imitation. The Greeks who had conquered Egypt now imitated her gods, hoping to steal their immortality. In this theater of splendor, Arsinoe's childhood unfolded like a ritual. She learned to read the stars, to move her hands in dance before sacred fires, to speak in the soft Egyptian tongue when blessing statues, and in the sharp Greek of philosophers when reciting Homer. She was a child of dual worlds, the blood of conquerors and the soul of the conquered, and already that duality began to fracture something deep within her. Her father adored her brilliance. He called her his son born, saying that her eyes carried the light of two civilizations. But behind that praise lay something darker, the knowledge that in royal bloodlines, daughters were never merely daughters, they were instruments, offerings, pawns to be married, sacrificed, or displayed in the name of dynasty. Yet Arsinoe, even as a child, felt the pulse of her own will, a dangerous inheritance from the same Alexandrian fire that had once driven armies across the world. When she was 10, she watched her father's council debate maps of kingdoms. She memorized not just the borders, but the way men trembled when they spoke of power. She understood that love was never free in a palace built on ambition. As years turned, the city around her became the center of the Mediterranean, its libraries swelling with scrolls, its harbors with warships. Alexandria was no mere city. It was a proclamation that Greek intellect could master Egyptian eternity. Within this furnace of ideas and power, Arsinoe bloomed. Poets compared her to Aphrodite, emerging from the Nile foam. Priests whispered that Isis herself had taken mortal form. But adoration is a double-edged crown. It gilds the cage it creates. Ptolemy, now aging and wary of rivals, saw in her the perfect emblem to unite Greeks and Egyptians, divine beauty with royal legitimacy. Yet for all her gilded education, Arsinoe longed for something beyond marble and politics. In secret, she wandered the palace gardens at night, listening to the chants of the priests, tracing the constellations reflected in the pools. She would whisper questions to the stars. Is my soul Greek or Egyptian? Am I daughter or deity? The stars gave no answer, but the silence planted restlessness in her heart. When Ptolemy I arranged her betrothal to Lysimachus, an aging general ruling distant Thrace, Arsinoe was barely 16. The union was strategic, not romantic. It would bind two fragments of Alexander's shattered empire. On the morning of her departure, Alexandria wept as if losing its moon. Draped in gold and lapis, Arsinoe boarded the royal ship. The harbor was perfumed with incense and tears. Her father's farewell was cold ceremony. He kissed her forehead, murmured a blessing to the gods, and turned away before she could speak. That night, As the ship moved northward under a sky the color of bronze, she watched the lighthouse fade into darkness, and with it, the last trace of childhood. In Thrace, her life became a theater of survival. Lysimachus was old, suspicious, and brutal. He had murdered sons to secure his throne. Yet he was bewitched by Arsinoe's youth and intelligence. She played the role of queen with precision, mastering court intrigue as though it were a second language. Letters from Egypt spoke of her father's death, of new rivalries among her brothers, of the shifting tides of empire. But she could not mourn. She had become a figure of statecraft, not flesh. At night, she dreamed of Alexandria's son, of her father's voice whispering lessons on power, and of the look in his eyes that once lingered too long. Perhaps it was only imagination. Perhaps it was the seed of the legend that would later damn her. But in those dreams, she saw herself standing beside him, not as daughter, but as equal, and that vision terrified her more than it comforted. Years later, when Lysimachus was slain in battle and Arsinoe's world once again fractured, she did not weep. She had already learned that tears were a currency too easily exploited. She fled with her sons to the city of Cassandreia, fortifying herself within its walls as new wars erupted between her brothers and stepbrothers. The empire of Alexander had become a carcass, picked apart by its heirs. Among them was Ptolemy Keranos, her half-brother, exiled, ambitious, consumed by resentment. He came to her city under the pretense of peace, offering alliance and protection. The chronicles say he was handsome in a cruel way, with eyes like his father's and a voice that could charm serpents. To the world, his arrival seemed a reunion of blood. To Arsinoe, it was the opening of an old wound, for in his face she saw the shadow of their father, the same hunger that turned love into domination. What happened next would haunt history. Some said Keranos seduced her, others said she sought him out, desperate for safety in a collapsing world. The truth, as always in royal tragedies, lies between desire and necessity. Their union, if union it was not of love, but of survival, sealed in a ritual that echoed the forbidden, a sibling marriage meant to imitate the divine pair Osiris and Isis, a sacrament to legitimize rule through sacred incest. In Egypt, such rites were theological symbols. In the Greek world, they were abominations. But Arsinoe was trapped between both. To the priests of Egypt, she was a goddess embodying cosmic balance. To the Greeks, a scandalous queen defying moral law. When word spread that she and her brother had shared both throne and bed, kingdoms recoiled. Yet to Arsinoe, perhaps it was not sin but destiny, the inevitable curse of being born where gods were made of family and family made of gods. But destiny is merciless. Keranos soon revealed his true nature. He murdered her sons, seized her crown, and declared himself king of Macedon. Arsinoe escaped, veiled and barefoot, wandering through the smoke of a ruined city, carrying the memory of dead children and the echo of a dynasty collapsing. Every step was a dialogue with grief. How could blood that once claimed divinity now taste of such corruption? The chronicles fade into myth here. Some say she cursed Keranos as he slept, calling upon Isis to avenge her. Others claim she stood silently as he burned years later, devoured by barbarian flames. Whatever the truth, Arsinoe did not die with her sorrow. She sailed again, always sailing, as though the sea itself were her confessor, back toward Egypt, toward the city that had birthed and exiled her. By the time she returned, The throne was held by her younger brother, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, another child of that fateful house, another son trying to outshine the shadow of their father. He welcomed her with ceremony, with processions of gold and hymns to divine siblings. The court whispered of reconciliation, of divine harmony, but beneath the rituals lay an ancient sickness, the dynasty's belief that to be godlike, they must love as gods did, that the marriage of brother and sister was not sin, but sanctification. And so, Arsinoe II was crowned not only as queen, but as Theophiladelphus, goddess of brotherly love. The title itself was a paradox. Holiness forged from taboo. On that day, when she stood beside her brother, both veiled in white, the people of Alexandria shouted blessings to the heavens. Yet behind the chants lurked unease, for everyone knew what such unions demanded: the erasure of the self in service of dynasty. For Arsinoe, it was the final transformation. The girl who once dreamed under the stars was gone. In her place stood a woman sculpted by power and loss. Her eyes no longer sought answers from the heavens. She had become one of the constellations herself, fixed, radiant, and unreachable. The chroniclers describe her reign as glorious. Temples built, fleets launched, Egypt's prosperity renewed. But glory is often the mask of despair. In the private chambers of the palace, she was said to keep a mirror from her childhood, cracked and clouded with age. Some nights, she would gaze into it until dawn, whispering to the reflection, "Which face is mine, the daughter, the sister, or the goddess?" The mirror never replied, only reflected the flicker of the oil lamps, like twin suns caught in eternal orbit, forever burning, forever devouring each other. Power, once tasted, becomes its own religion, and in Arsinoe's Egypt, the air itself seemed to worship her. From the marble steps of the Serapeum to the green depths of the Nile Delta, her image bloomed on every coin, statue, and temple wall. She and Ptolemy II were painted as the divine twins of heaven, Isis and Osiris reborn, the eternal lovers who held the universe in balance. Processions thundered through Alexandria with golden barges and flower-strewn streets. Hymns filled the air, chanting her name as Philadelphus, beloved of her brother. Yet beneath the perfume of devotion lingered the scent of unease. Scholars from Athens whispered behind scrolls. Merchants crossed themselves in quiet disbelief, and even the Egyptian priests who crowned her hesitated before kneeling too low. But none dared defy the queen who ruled both as goddess and strategist, the woman whose eyes saw through marble and politics alike. Arsinoe governed as if she had learned from every betrayal, every loss. She understood that love and loyalty were currencies, and she spent them with precision. She reformed taxes, strengthened fleets, built sanctuaries for Isis and Aphrodite alike, twin symbols of her divided soul. Her voice guided ambassadors, her seal decided wars, and through it all, the city adored her. To the common people, she was the Nile's own daughter, the living promise that Egypt would never again bow to foreign chaos. But within the palace walls, the golden facade began to tremble. Ptolemy's affection, once reverent, grew possessive. What had begun as sacred union turned into silent rivalry. Each decree bore both their names, yet every triumph was claimed by courtiers for one or the other. The harmony of heaven soured into the politics of earth. Still, Arsinoe wore serenity like armor. She understood that in myth, emotion is weakness, and she was now a living myth. Her attendant said she moved like a statue come to life, slow, deliberate, untouched by time. Yet in private, her nights grew haunted. The ghosts of her murdered sons walked the corridors of her memory. The echo of her father's voice returned, soft and insidious. Dynasty is destiny, my son born. Even love must serve the throne. Sometimes, when the torches burned low, she imagined those words carved upon her heart. To silence her thoughts, she built. She raised a temple to herself on Cape Zephyrium, where sea winds sang through marble columns and priests offered incense to Arsinoe Aphrodite. There, sailors prayed for safe passage, lovers swore oaths, and poets declared her beauty the equal of the dawn. Yet the woman inside the marble could not escape the price of divinity, isolation. A goddess may be adored, but she is never touched without permission. Ptolemy, seeing her drift into transcendence, sought to bind her more tightly to earth, through power, through ritual, through control. He ordered her likeness engraved on his own breastplate, her crown fused with his in festivals, her name sung with his in the sacred calendar. Together, they became inseparable in image and law, but the more their names entwined, the further their souls drifted apart. Arsinoe had long ceased to be a woman. She was an empire disguised as flesh. When famine struck Lower Egypt, she rode through the parched fields herself, veiled in linen, feeding children with her own hands. The people wept and called her divine mercy. Chroniclers record miracles, rains returning after her prayers, crops rising from dust. But in the silence that followed, she confessed to her handmaiden that she no longer believed in gods, only in symbols that men kill for. That single sentence, if ever written, would have been treason. Instead, it dissolved into rumor, like perfume into wind. Yet it marked the moment Arsinoe crossed the final boundary between mortal and myth, the realization that divinity was only the art of endurance. Years passed, and her power became legend. Poets from Rhodes and philosophers from Cyrene arrived to praise her intellect. She debated astronomy, approved new expeditions, and even sent offerings to Delphi, a queen who ruled the seas as Alexander once ruled the land. But with greatness came loneliness. At banquets, she sat beside her brother-husband, radiant yet remote, while music echoed through halls of gold. She smiled as ambassadors bowed, but her gaze always drifted toward the horizon, where the sea shimmered like a memory she could never reach. In that gaze lay the tragedy of every god-king. The higher they ascend, the further they drift from the warmth of ordinary hearts. The final chapter began quietly, without prophecy or thunder. One evening, as the court celebrated a naval victory, Arsinoe fainted. Physicians spoke of fever, exhaustion, perhaps divine visitation. For weeks she lay in her chamber overlooking the harbor, the scent of lotus heavy in the air. Outside, crowds prayed for her recovery. Inside, time thickened around her like resin. Ptolemy sat by her bed, murmuring hymns they had once recited as children, but she no longer heard him. Instead, she drifted through the corridors of her mind, revisiting every mirror of her life. Her father's approving eyes, the screams of her sons, the vows of the priests, the salt-bitten decks of exile. In each reflection, she sought a single face, her own, unmasked by crown or myth. But the mirror of memory showed only symbols, daughter, sister, queen, goddess, each more distant than the last. When dawn came, she rose from her bed and ordered the windows opened. The sea breathed in, cool and fragrant. Witnesses say she stood for a long time, gazing toward the lighthouse, that eternal flame guiding ships home. Then, with the calm of one who has already crossed death, she whispered, "I am not the light, nor the flame, but the reflection between them. Moments later, she collapsed. By the time the sun fully rose, the queen of two worlds was gone. The city mourned for 70 days. Temples draped in white, ships lowered sails, priests proclaimed her ascension. Her brother decreed that she be worshipped as a full deity. Her cult spread from Egypt to Greece. Her name etched upon altars and coins for generations. Yet, even in worship, there was irony. The woman who had become divine through forbidden love was now remembered as the patroness of pure devotion. History had rewritten her sin into sanctity, but stories never die. They metamorphose. Centuries later, travelers at the ruins of Cape Zephyrium swore that at dusk, when the tide hissed against the stones, a figure appeared above the water, veiled in gold light, neither woman nor statue. The fishermen said she walked on the surface of the sea, her feet leaving ripples shaped like lotus petals. She would pause, gaze toward the horizon, and vanish with the wind. Some called her a ghost, others a goddess returning to her temple. Yet those who listened closely claimed they heard her whisper through the waves. Power is a mirror that devours its own reflection. Thus ended Arsinoe II, not in scandal, but in metamorphosis. She began as a daughter, was remade as a queen, sanctified as a goddess, and remembered as a myth. The chroniclers wrote of her victories and her temples, but the true story, the one carved in silence, is of a woman forced to play divine roles in a world that feared her humanity. She loved her father and was cursed by that love. She ruled with her brother and was bound by that bond. She built an empire only to find herself walled within it. And yet, against all the cruelty of time, her image endures. The eternal woman who refused to vanish, who turned pain into power and scandal into divinity. In every museum relief, her eyes still hold that impossible calm, not pride, not sorrow, but awareness. The awareness of one who has seen gods fall and men pretend to be gods, who knows that every empire is merely another mask worn by mortality. As the centuries blur, her legend remains suspended between reverence and warning. To historians, she is a political genius. To poets, a tragic muse. To the Nile, perhaps, still its daughter. And maybe that is her ultimate victory, to be remembered not as victim or villain, but as the mirror through which every age must see itself. When the sun sets over Alexandria and the sea turns to gold, the waves still murmur her name, not as curse, not as prayer, but as question. What becomes of a heart when it is forced to be divine? The answer floats somewhere between the stars and the tide, where Arsinoe II, the queen who defied love, still waits, immortal, not because she was worshipped, but because she was never understood.